Well, Shabbat Shalom. I just want to welcome everyone to the Sabbath Day conference call. We want to welcome all our family and friends that are here today. And maybe you're listening to the recording. We want to welcome you too. And we invite everyone to go to the website, lunarsabbathday.com. There are a lot of videos there and articles. In fact, this article is on there today. I just posted it on there today that we're going to be talking about. And the name of this is Jewish Writings Prove Lunar Sabbath to be True. Well, we know the scripture proves it, but it's nice to see the historical evidence. So what Sabbath did Yeshua keep? Well, everyone agrees that the Messiah kept the right day for the Sabbath during his time on earth. And the Jews of that day kept the right day as well, because there was never any kind of disagreement on this during that time. So we need only to figure out what day the Jews kept in that time period to determine how to reckon the seventh-day Sabbath today. So let's look at the historical record and how the Jews observed the Sabbath in that time period. And I did take most of this article from exposingtheenemy.com. And here is the first quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia, Holidays. The new moon is still, and the Sabbath originally was, dependent upon the lunar cycle. And Brother Pete's going to help me read a lot of the quotes here. And I just want you to know all the links are going to be listed below so that you can look them up yourself. So New Moon Festival was not counted among the 7 days of the week. And I'm not hearing you, Brother Pete. Go ahead.
Excuse me. The Sabbath, as marking the end of the week, reveals its lunar origin. The phases of the moon having taught the shepherds whose wheel or who depended on largely upon the benevolence or malevolence of the night season, to divide the period elapsing between two new moons into 4 equal groups, that is weeks, the last day of each, in imitation of the moon's coming to rest, as it were, becoming the day of rest. Indications are not wanting that at first the new moon festival was not counted among the 7 days of the week, but after 7 times 4, which is equal to 28, days had elapsed. 1 or 2 days were intercalated as new moon days, whereupon a new moon cycle of 4 weeks began, so that the Sabbath was a movable festival. Later, the week and the Sabbath became fixed, and this gradually resulted in taking away from the new moon festival its popular importance. Classification of festivals. Those connected with the new moon, a Sabbath.
Okay, so the Sabbath, depending on Israel's nomadic period, upon the observation of the phases of the moon. And for those of you that maybe are just on the phone, I have the moon phases over here, a picture for you, for everyone.
Probable lunar origin, critical view. The origin of the Sabbath, as well as the true meaning of the name, is uncertain. It was probably originally connected in some manner with the cult of the moon, as indeed is suggested by the frequent mention of Sabbath and new moon festivals in the same sentence. The Sabbath, depending in Israel's nomadic period upon the observation of the phases of the moon. It could not, according to this view, be a fixed day when the Israelites settled in the land and became farmers. Their new life would have made it desirable that the Sabbath should come at regular intervals, and the desired change would have made all the more easy as they abandoned the lunar religion.
So these are quotes. There's more to it, so just be patient. So the Sabbath was originally by the phases of the moon. That's what it says in these writings, and there's much more to go. So it's amazing that these confessions come straight from the Jewish Encyclopedia. It specifically says that the Sabbath was originally by the phases of the moon. It was not a fixed day like it is today, and that would be Saturday. They try to justify this by saying the Israelites were coming out of a moon cult, and when the Sabbath was turned into a fixed day, that was the proper intent by Jehovah. That is an amazing confession. The moon cult spin is obviously false, as Jehovah taught the Israelites the true lunar Sabbath and lunar calendar from the beginning of its journey out of Egypt. And the week of 7 days was connected with the lunar month, of which it is approximately a fourth. A week is a fourth of the month.
From the Jewish Encyclopedia. Week, connected with lunar phases, a division of time comprising 7 days, thus explaining the Hebrew name. There are indications of the use of another system of reckoning time, in which the month was divided into 3 parts of 10 days each, the decade being designated in Hebrew by the term Asor, in Genesis 55, yes. This apparently represented 1/3 of the solar month, while the week of 7 days was connected with the lunar month, of which it is approximately a fourth. The quadriparte division of the month was evidently in use among the Hebrews and other ancient peoples, but it is not clear whether it originated among the former. It is unnecessary to assume, however, that it was derived from the Babylonians, for it is equally possible that the observation of the 4 phases of the moon led the Hebrew nomads spontaneously and independently to devise the system of dividing the interval between the successive new moons into 4 groups of 7 days each.
The first day of the first week of the month was made to coincide with the new moon.
Week continued. There is ground, on the other hand, for the assumption that both among the Babylonians and among the Hebrews, the first day of the first week of the month was always reckoned as coincident with the first day of the month. The emphasis laid on the requirement that the weeks of Pentecost should be complete suggests that the weeks might be reckoned in such a way as to violate this injunction. This was the case as long as the first day of the first week of the month was made to coincide with the new moon. At the end of 4 weeks, an interval of 1 or 2 days might intervene before the new week could begin. At an earlier date, however, this intimate connection between the week and the moon must have been dissolved, the chief cause of the fixed week of 7 days being, in all probability, the predominance of the 7th day as the Sabbath.
Okay, and I have a calendar over here showing New Moon Day as day 1, beginning the month. And then you have each week with the Sabbath on the end of each week. So the Sabbath was never a continuous weekly cycle. Wow, wow. And let me just say wow. This is the author, his writing. And it's unbelievable that all of this is in the Jewish Encyclopedia. The Jews in the know actually admit this stuff. And they know the Sabbath was never a continuous weekly cycle. They tell you out in the open that the Sabbath was originally by the phases of the moon. New month declared by observation of the new moon.
Declaring the new month by observation of the new moon and the new year by the arrival of spring can only be done by the Sanhedrin. In the time of Hillel, which is the 4th century A.D., the Romans prohibited this practice. Hillel II was therefore forced to institute his fixed calendar. That's in the Jewish calendar, changing the calendar.
The Jewish calendar was fixed by Hillel too, and we did a YouTube on that too. I hope you'll go and watch that.
Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, a well-known scholar from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, emphatically stated, quote, "The present Jewish calendar was fixed in the 4th century," end quote.
So the Jewish calendar is based upon the mean motions of the sun and moon.
Maimonides, a medieval Jewish scholar, and most other Jewish chronologers agree that the modern Jewish calendar is based upon the, quote, mean motions of the sun and moon, the true calendar having been set aside, end quote.
Okay, the true calendar is in the heavens. We're finding out that it's even in the Jewish records. So here's Philo of Alexandria. Well, Philo of Alexandria was a prominent Jew that lived from approximately 20 BC to 50 AD. So not only did he live before the Messiah, he lived during and after as well. And we know that Philo's writings and beliefs are consistent with the Jews' beliefs because he was handpicked by the Jews of that time to head a Jewish delegation to represent the Jews in a massacre that had occurred against the Jews in 39 AD. And we know that Sabbath observance is a staple in Jewish belief. The Jews would not have selected someone to represent them had that person not kept the correct day for the Sabbath. If Philo kept the lunar Sabbath while everyone else kept the Sabbath according to a continuous weekly cycle, then Philo would be an outcast among his people and would never be considered for such a prominent position to represent them. So how did Philo reckon the seventh-day Sabbath? And we know that Philo did observe the lunar Sabbath, and it's clear that he did. He never once mentioned anything about a continuous weekly cycle on a Saturday Sabbath. There was no Saturday at that time. That all happened later in the 4th century. So he observed the new moon and emphasized its importance as well. We are also able to gain much information and confirmation of the scriptures from his writings about the finer details about how Jehovah's calendar works. And we should not ignore eyewitness testimonies from prominent Jewish leaders of that time period that very plainly explain to us from recorded history how things were done. And this is excellent corroborative evidence to the scriptures and further proof of the lunar Sabbath. The periodical changes of the moon take place according to the number 7. And here's what Philo says.
Allegorical interpretation. It says, quote, "Again, the periodic changes of the moon take place according to the number 7. That star, the moon that is, having the greatest sympathy with the things on earth. And the changes which the moon works in the air, it perfects chiefly in accordance with its own configurations on each seventh day. At all events, all mortal things, as I have said before, drawing their more divine nature from the heaven, are moved in a manner which tends to their preservation in accordance with this number 7. Accordingly, on the 7th day, Elohim caused the rest from his work which he had made.
Okay, so those of you that can see the screen, there's a graph here of the 7-day week. There's the first quarter, and that's the first week. The first Sabbath is the 8th day, and then you have the full moon, which is in the middle of the month, is the 15th day. Then the last quarter, so there's a week between each phase. So the moon perfects its own configurations in each of the 7 days. Notice that Philo says the moon is perfect in its shape or appearance at 7-day intervals. Had a Hebrew-speaking Israelite written this, he would have said it perfects chiefly in accordance with its own configurations on each Sabbath day instead of each, quote, 7th day. Because elsewhere in his writings, Philo identifies that when he mentions the 7th day, brackets of the week, he is speaking of the Sabbath. Above, he tells us that the moon perfects its own configurations on each 7th day. It was understood that at the end of each period of 6 work days, there would be a weekly Sabbath. The Greek-speaking Jews referred to the Sabbath as the 7th day or the sacred 7th day, while in the language of the Hebrews it was termed Shabbat, or the Sabbath. So here again we have a picture with the quarter phases and then the Sabbath. The 7th day of the week, he has assigned the greatest festivals. Okay, here's more from Philo.
The Decalogue, 30 at 159. But to the 7th day of the week, he has assigned the greatest festivals, those of the longest duration at the periods of the equinox, both vernal and autumnal, in each year, appointing 2 festivals for these 2 epochs, each lasting 7 days, the one which takes place in the spring being for the perfection of what is being sown, and the one which falls in autumn being the Feast of Thanksgiving for the bringing home of all the fruits which the trees have produced.
Okay, so there's a biblical calendar up here showing the spring feast, and then one here with the fall feast, tabernacles. The spring is the Passover, and showing what he said, that each feast is 1 week long, and each one lasting 7 days. So Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. And so let's look carefully at what Philo was saying. To the 7th day of the week, he, the Father above, has assigned the greatest festivals. In other words, the greatest, longest festivals have been assigned to the 7th day of the week. Philo, keeping the same lunar solar calendar established in Scripture, calls the first day of each of these 7-day feasts the 7th day of the week, the first day of the feast. Okay, Scripture says that both of the 7th-day feasts, unleavened bread and tabernacles, begin on the 15th day of their respective months. Okay, so there's Passover again, and there's tabernacles, the spring feast and fall feast. So Philo is saying that the first day of each of the 7-day feasts is the 7th day of the week. So the 15th is a Sabbath. He's saying it is the 7th day of the week. So Sabbaths are always the ones that can be dated in Scripture are the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of the month. And the 7th day of the week is a Sabbath, is it not? And it is the 7th day of the week every year. And if the 15th is the weekly Sabbath, so are the 8th, 22nd and 29th days of the month. Here's a calendar over here. If the 15th is a Sabbath, so is the 8th, so is the 22nd and 29th. And notice Philo did not say they would receive 2 holidays of festivals, but one, the 15th. Saturday Sabbath keepers insist that there will be a Saturday Sabbath that interrupts these 7-day feasts. And indeed, if the Gregorian calendar were the calendar of Scripture, that would be true. But Scripture says nothing of a Saturday Sabbath in the middle of these 7-day feasts.
To prove the 7th day of the week is the same as the 15th elsewhere, Philo states, quote, "And this feast is begun on the 15th day of the month, in the middle of the month, on the day on which the moon is full of light. In consequence, on the providence of Elohim, taking care that there shall be no darkness on that day."
I really like these quotes from Philo, and then there's some more coming about the 15th day being the middle of the month and full of light. So the 15th day is a full moon. It is full of light. It is in the middle of the month. And there are some teachings going around about a new moon on a full white moon. And this is not true. And all these historical evidences do prove it. So the feast began on the 15th day. It began on the 15th day of the month, and it is the middle of the month, and it is when the moon is full of light. So the weekly Sabbath, the 15th, begins the spring and fall festivals. In other words, Philo is saying the weekly Sabbath begins these feasts and is on the 15th, which I had just said. This proves the Sabbath by the lunar calendar because there's no way the weekly Sabbath, or the 15th, can begin these 2 festivals on the 15th in the 1st and 7th month each year on a continuous 7-day cycle presented by the Gregorian calendar that we have today. So the moon, in its perfection, shapes in periods of 7 days.
Speaking of lunar intervals,
here's Philo again.
Speaking of lunar intervals in special laws, 1, Philo writes, quote, "There is one principle of reason by which the moon waxes and wanes in each interval, both as it increases and diminishes in illumination, the 7 lambs, because it receives the perfect shape in periods of 7 days. The half moon in the first 7-day period after its conjunction with the sun, the full moon in the second, and when it takes its return again, the first is to half moon. Then it ceases at its conjunction with the sun."
Okay, and there's a picture over here to the right for you to look at. So the moon receives its perfect shapes in periods of 7 days. The half moon, the first quarter moon, announces the first Sabbath of the month. It is the 7th day of the week, naturally, but this is the 8th day of the month. New moon day is not counted against the week. The full moon rising at the end of the 14th day of the month announces the 15th as the second Sabbath of the month. If the new moon was counted, the quarter phases, or as Philo describes them, the moon as it's perfect in its own configurations on each 7th day, would not come out at the end of the week, disconnecting the perfection of the lunar cycle from the Sabbath. So what Jehovah has joined together, let no man put asunder. Full moon is at the end of the second week, the 15th day. And here's more from Philo.
Philo gives a second witness on mating with preliminary studies. "For it is said in the Scriptures, on the 10th day of this month let each of them take a sheep according to his house, in order that from the 10th there may be consecrated to the 10th, that is, to Elohim, the sacrifices which have been preserved in the soul, which is illuminated in 2 portions out of the 3, until it is entirely changed in every part, and becomes a heavenly brilliance, like a full moon at the height of its increase, at the end of the 2nd week.
Okay, so the end of the 2nd week is the 15th, and it's the first day of unleavened bread. And of course, when he's talking about the lamb on the 10th day, he's talking about the first month when they chose a lamb for Passover. So full moon is at the end of the 2nd week again, and here is a picture of the first Sabbath being a quarter, and the 2nd Sabbath, and the 3rd Sabbath. Well, this looks a little backwards. It's probably from like Australia, because it's white on the wrong side for me where I'm at. So in this graph. So please let what Philo just said sink in. His readers in those days understood that the weeks were by the moon, same as in the scripture, and that at the end of the 2nd week there would be a full moon. This statement needs no interpretation and is impossible to misunderstand. And so the sacred 7th day of the week, which comes at the end of the 2nd week of each month, is a full moon. And there it is on the calendar, and you can check that out in Psalms 81, 3 through 6. People would like for us to believe that the months were originally by the moon, but the weeks were not. Philo was making a simple observation of how a person can be spiritually illuminated to a full brilliance, just like a full moon at the height of its increase at the end of the 2nd week. Friend, is there a Sabbath at the end of that 2nd week? Philo did not count the new moon when counting out the weeks as calendars do today. This statement is very easily proven from the writings of Philo, because he stated in other places throughout his book that the full moon is on the 15th each month, and he also separates the new moon from the weeks as a separate feast day. So we have Ezekiel 46, 1 and 3 that prove the new moon and Sabbath cannot fall on any of the 6 working days. So writers today would instead count the new moon day in counting their weeks, but it's obvious from Philo that he did not. Philo recognized the same order of the month as it is described in Scripture. Ezekiel 46, 1 and verse 3 proves the new moon and Sabbath cannot fall on any of the 6 working days. So you can see Amos 8:5, 2 Kings 4:23, Isaiah 66:22 to 23. And these verses are corroborating witnesses. If the new moon was counted as the first day of the week, at the end of the 2nd week, the full moon would rise before the 14th instead of the 15th, as Philo plainly declares many times. So we did a video about 3 types of days in Scripture showing that New Moon Day is not a work day. But the point being made here is New Moon Day is the beginning of the month. Then you have your 6 work days. And to keep the quarter phases perfect, the new moon, the full moon rises on the 14th to announce the Sabbath as the 15th. That's what Philo was stating. So the new moon was not counted in the counting out of weeks. Okay, and then this graph again, I think, if you're in Australia, you see the quarter phases full on the opposite sides, but full moon and conjunction would all be the same. So this graph is a little backwards the way I look at it here in America. Okay, back to this author, what he writes. In other words, you have your new moon worship day, and then 6 work days, and then the weekly Sabbath on the 8th day of the moon, Ezekiel 46:1. You then have 6 more work days and a full moon on day 15, or at the end of the 2nd week, or 2nd 7. This proves the new moon was not counted in counting out the weeks, same as Jehovah did not count it in Exodus, the 16th chapter, when he made the Sabbath known to Moses. If the new moon was ever counted in counting out the weeks in Scripture, there would be pinpointed weekly Sabbaths on the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th, etc. Yet, you cannot find these days pinpointed as weekly Sabbaths anywhere in Scripture, because these days are always the preparation days for the weekly Sabbath. When Philo spoke of the 10th or the 15th day of the month, he was counting the new moon day in his count. But it is an absolute that when he counted out the week, he did not count new moon, which itself proves lunar weeks. Remember, Philo is just stating how things were done in his day. Okay, here's some more quotes from Clement of Alexandria. Well into the 2nd century, the lunar Sabbaths were still being kept.
Clement lived between 150 AD and 215 AD. Well into the 2nd century, the lunar Sabbath was still being kept. In Volume 6, Chapter 16 of the Stromata, Clement plainly writes that, quote, in periods of 7 days, the moon undergoes its changes. In the first week, she becomes full half moon. In the second week, that is week, full moon. And in the third week, in her wane, again half moon. And in the 4th week, she disappears. Clearly, these are lunar weeks that are tied to the phases of the moon.
So the moon is tied to the Sabbath.
In the Stomata, chapter 5, says, quote, Peter inferred thus, neither worship as the Jews, for if the moon is not visible, they do not hold the Sabbath, which is called the first, nor do they hold the new moon, nor the festival of unleavened bread, nor feast, nor the great day. Again, the moon is tied to the Sabbath.
And here are some other accounts.
The first is found in the Talmud, the Steinsaltz edition, volume 14, tractate, I'll just skip all that, part 2, Institute for Talmudic Publications and Milta Books, pages 105 to 106. It says the following regarding the destruction of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar's army. Page 105, quote, then late in the day of the 9th, close to nightfall, they set the temple on fire, and it continued to burn the entire next day on the 10th. Page 106, quote, when the temple was destroyed for the first time at the hands of Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, that day was the 9th of Eve, and it was the day following Shabbat, and it was the year following the sabbatical year. And similarly, when the temple was destroyed a second time at the hands of Titus, the destruction occurred on the very same day, the 9th of Eve.
So the 8th day of the month is the Sabbath. So guess what day the 9th of Av, when Titus destroyed the temple? Guess what day the 9th of Av was? Okay, the day after the weekly Sabbath, naturally. If I've done the math right, the 9th day of the month follows the 8th day of the month, correct? And if the 8th day of the month is the Sabbath, so are the 15th, the 22nd, the 29th. So Sabbaths that can be pinpointed are always on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. And here are some words from Josephus.
The historian Josephus records Sabbaths that can be pinpointed, and they are on the 18th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th, and the new moon was not counted as one of the 6 work days. Josephus records in an interesting type of strategy by General Pompey and the Romans. The Romans saw that the Hebrews did not fight on the Sabbath unless attacked, so the Romans simply moved their engines and battery rams up to the wall on the Sabbath day, which otherwise they could not do. And on the next day they battered the city. See pages so-and-so, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 14. Quote, "For although the city, Jerusalem, was taken by the 3rd month, on the day of the fast," end quote. And that's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 14, Chapter 4, Section 3. Footnote C, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 14, Chapter 4 and 3, page 270. That is on the 23rd of Sivan, the annual fast for the defecation and idolatry of Jeroboam, who made my people Israel to sin, or possibly some other fast might fall on that month, before and in the days of Josephus.
Okay, so how many fasts do you know if in the 3rd month? And I did not even know this one. And this one, I find this fascinating because Jeroboam is the one who introduced Saturday worship to Israel. Remember, he introduced a false month for the worship. So if memory serves me, the 23rd day of the month follows the 22nd day of the month is the Sabbath. So are the 8th, 15th, 29th days of the month. So the Jewish writings prove lunar Sabbath is true. And this is not an exhaustive list of historical writings that prove the lunar Sabbath. There is most certainly a lot more than this. But if you're not convinced by now, there is not enough evidence to ever convince you. The historical record from the Jews themselves proves the lunar Sabbath. So again, which calendar did Yeshua keep? Did he keep the one by the heavens or a Gregorian, Pope Gregory Roman Catholic calendar with a Saturday Sabbath? I'll let you decide that for yourself. So thank you, Brother Pete, for reading. A lot of that was really difficult quotes, and I'm glad that you read them. And thank you, everyone, for listening today. And everyone that's here, please stand by for our group conversation and discussion. So Shabbat Shalom. We'll be back next week, Yah willing.